In 2013, a 50-year-old former bus driver in Caracas, Venezuela, controlled one of the world's largest oil reserves. By 2025, he had turned that $300 billion in national wealth into a $2 billion personal fortune, while 8 million Venezuelans fled and 94% fell into poverty. His name was Nicolás Maduro. And the system he built, the resource extraction mechanisms he perfected, the debt trap structures he pioneered with China and Russia, they didn't end when U.S. Special Forces captured him on January 3, 2026. They evolved, they spread, and they're being replicated by authoritarian leaders across the world right now. The oil Venezuela produces, the debt for resources, deals China signs, the narco-state models emerging in Latin America, the way Russia acquires resource access through loans that will never be repaid, every single one uses the Maduro playbook. State resource nationalization, currency control arbitrage, oil for debt traps with rival powers, narco-terrorism for regime survival, and gold extraction outside the international banking system. Maduro didn't just loot Venezuela. He built the architecture of modern authoritarian resource extraction in a multipolar world order, and you cannot escape it because the system isn't Venezuela. The system is the method. And that method has been replicated by every resource-rich authoritarian regime partnering with China and Russia for the last 15 years. Belarus uses it, Myanmar uses it, Zimbabwe uses it, Equatorial Guinea uses it. They all learn from the same blueprint, the Maduro blueprint. Control state resources, create currency arbitrage, sell future production to China and Russia through debt. Use criminal enterprise when sanctions cut off legitimate finance. And when Western powers finally remove you from power, make sure the resource deals you signed survive the transition. Let me show you exactly how Maduro built this system, how he used it to become a billionaire while his country collapsed, how his capture on the 3rd of January 2026 didn't end the system, and why authoritarian leaders from Belarus to Myanmar are watching Venezuela right now to see if the model survives. Because understanding the system isn't academic, it's geopolitical survival. The system is designed to transfer resource sovereignty from nations to authoritarian rulers backed by great powers. And once you see how it works, you'll see it everywhere. Nicolás Maduro was born in 1962 inches Caracas. He was a bus driver, then a union organizer. In 1999, Hugo Chavez brought him into government. When Chavez died in March 2013, Maduro became president. He inherited the world's largest oil reserves and a functioning state oil company. This is where Maduro's genius emerged. He understood that Venezuela's oil could be converted into personal fortune through a specific mechanism, abandoning the Western-dominated order and partnering with China and Russia, who wanted resources more than democracy. The genius wasn't in the looting. The genius was in the structure. Maduro built a system where looting the nation strengthened his international position by giving China and Russia permanent resource claims. He turned corruption into geopolitical strategy. Let me show you the 5 mechanisms Maduro used to turn Venezuela's oil into his personal fortune while selling the nation's resource sovereignty to foreign powers. Mechanism 1. PDVSA as personal ATM. PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, controls all Venezuela's oil. In 1998, PDVSA produced 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2024, production had collapsed to 500,000 barrels per day. That's 3 million barrels per day lost. At $80 per barrel, that's $240 million per day, $87 billion per year. Over 12 years, over $1 trillion in lost production. Where did it go? Over $300 billion was diverted through fake contracts and phantom projects. PDVSA signed contracts with shell companies controlled by Maduro allies. Services were never delivered. Equipment never arrived. Money went to accounts in Andorra and Switzerland. Example, 2015, PDVSA paid $2.2 billion to Derwick Associates, owned by Alejandro Betancourt, for housing. The housing was never built. Betancourt bought a $80 million Madrid mansion. Another, $450 million to Tariq El Aissami's shell companies for fuel that never arrived. Over and over. Billions in contracts, nothing delivered, money to specific accounts. PDVSA stopped investing in maintenance. Investment fell from 15% of revenue to near zero. The money went to personal accounts instead of keeping production running. This is the method. Nationalize the resource. Award contracts to loyalists. Divert the payments. Let production collapse while personal fortunes grow. Mechanism 2. Currency control arbitrage. Venezuela set an official exchange rate between bolivars and dollars that bore no relation to reality. In 2013, official rate, $1 equals 6.3 bolivars. Black market, 40 bolivars. By 2018, official, 10 bolivars. Black market, 250,000 bolivars. By 2025, official, 36 bolivars. Black market, over 40 million bolivars. If you were in Maduro's inner circle, you accessed dollars at the official rate. Exchange 10 bolivars for $1. Sell that dollar on the black market for 250,000 bolivars. That's a 25,000 times profit on one transaction. Who controlled access? Maduro and approximately 200 people, military generals, family members, close allies. Everyone else bought dollars at black market rates. Between $30 billion and $50 billion was extracted through currency arbitrage between 2013 and 2025. The inflation this created destroyed Venezuelan savings. The wealth transferred to Maduro's network through the gap. This is the method. Create an artificial exchange rate. Grant favorable access only to loyalists. Arbitrage the gap. The currency collapses. The elite extracts billions. Mechanism 3. Oil for debt trap with China and Russia. Here's where the Maduro system becomes a blueprint for the emerging multipolar order. And here's where Venezuela demonstrates how rising powers are using debt to acquire permanent resource access. China began lending to Venezuela in 2007 under Hugo Chavez. Between 2007 and 2024, China lent Venezuela over $50 billion through the China Development Bank and China National Petroleum Corporation. This wasn't development aid. This wasn't charity. This was a carefully structured resource acquisition strategy. The loans came with a specific repayment mechanism. Venezuela would repay not in currency, but in oil. This is critical. The loans weren't denominated in dollars to be repaid in dollars. They were denominated in barrels of oil to be repaid in barrels of oil. Venezuela currently sends 600,000 barrels of oil per day to China as debt repayment. At $80 per barrel, that's $48 million per day, $17.5 billion per year. But here's where the extraction mechanism becomes clear. Venezuela doesn't send oil at market prices. The loan agreements specify that oil is valued at approximately $60 per barrel for repayment purposes, below the market price. So Venezuela is sending $48 million worth of oil per day, but only getting credit for $36 million per day in debt repayment. China is getting a $12 million per day discount, $4.4 billion per year in below-market oil. Now check the math on repayment. Venezuela owes China $50 billion. At $36 million per day in debt repayment credit, that's $13.1 billion per year. At that rate, it would take 3.8 years to repay the debt. But Venezuela has continued borrowing from China throughout Maduro's rule. And Venezuela's oil production keeps falling, which means 600,000 barrels per day represents an increasing percentage of total output. In 1998, 600,000 barrels per day was 17% of Venezuela's production. In 2024, it's more than 100% of Venezuela's production. How is Venezuela sending more oil to China than it produces? By importing oil from other countries, refining it minimally or not at all, and shipping it to China to maintain the loan repayment schedule. Venezuela is buying oil on the international market to send to China to service debt. This is not sustainable. This is not repayment. This is permanent resource transfer disguised as a loan. Here's the critical insight. Venezuela will never repay this debt. China knows this. The debt structure is designed to be unpayable. The debt is a mechanism to secure permanent access to Venezuelan oil at below-market prices. China has effectively purchased a significant portion of Venezuela's oil output in perpetuity for $50 billion paid out over time as loans. It's not a loan. It's a resource acquisition disguised as debt. Russia employed an identical strategy. Between 2010 and 2024, Russia invested approximately $17 billion in Venezuela's oil sector, mostly through Rosneft, the state oil company controlled by Putin allies. These weren't loans. They were equity investments that gave Russia ownership stakes in Venezuelan oil fields and refining infrastructure. Russia now owns controlling interests in 5 major Venezuelan oil fields through joint ventures with PDVSA. The oil from these fields doesn't belong to Venezuela. It belongs to Rosneft. The contracts specify that Rosneft owns the production rights for 30 years, regardless of who governs Venezuela. When Venezuela's government changes, when Maduro is removed, these contracts remain in force. Russia has acquired permanent legal claims on Venezuelan oil production. This is the new model of great power competition in the multipolar order. China and Russia don't invade Venezuela militarily. They don't overthrow the government. They don't need to. They lend money the government can never repay and structure the loans to take oil as collateral. They make equity investments that give them ownership of physical infrastructure and production rights. When the authoritarian government eventually collapses or is removed, the debt obligations and equity contracts remain in force. The resources have been legally transferred from national sovereignty to foreign control. For Maduro personally, this system was perfect. China and Russia provided billions in loans and investments when Western banks cut Venezuela off. Maduro could skim from these deals the same way he skimmed from PDVSA contracts. He maintained power because China and Russia kept providing money even as Venezuela's economy collapsed. And when he's eventually removed from power, the Chinese loans and Russian equity stakes remain. Maduro got his fortune. China and Russia got Venezuela's oil. The Venezuelan people got poverty. This is what Trump meant when he said the United States will be very strongly involved in Venezuela's oil industry going forward. The legal infrastructure of resource extraction has been transferred to China and Russia through debt and investment deals that Maduro signed. Reversing this requires either buying out the Chinese and Russian claims at enormous cost or declaring the contracts invalid, which creates massive complications under international law. The Maduro system didn't just enrich one man. It sold Venezuela's resource sovereignty to rival great powers in exchange for the cash flow that kept Maduro in power and filled his accounts. This is the architecture of the emerging multipolar order. Authoritarian leaders trade national resources to China and Russia for personal power and financial backing, while their populations suffer and the great powers acquire the resources they need without military conquest or colonial occupation. This is the method. Borrow from China and Russia in amounts you can never repay. Structure the loans to be repaid in resources, not currency. Accept below-market prices for resources sent as debt repayment. Grant equity stakes in resource production. When you're eventually removed, the resource deals survive. China and Russia get permanent resource access. You get temporary power and personal wealth. Mechanism 4. Narco-terrorism through Cartel de los Soles. The U.S. indictment centers on Maduro's leadership of Cartel de los Soles, named after sun insignia worn by Venezuelan generals. This wasn't a traditional cartel. This was the Venezuelan state as a narco-terrorism enterprise. Cartel de los Soles provided protection for Colombian cocaine moving to the U.S. and Europe. They used Venezuelan military aircraft, ports, and diplomatic pouches. In exchange, a cut of every shipment. U.S. prosecutors estimate 200 to 250 tons of cocaine transit Venezuela annually. At wholesale prices, $5 to $6 billion per year. At a 20% cut, over $1 billion annually to Venezuelan officials. Who controlled it? The indictment says Maduro at the top. Below him, Vice President Tarek El Aissami, indicted for narco-terrorism in 2020, and Diosdado Cabello, operational chief coordinating with FARC dissidents. Trump designated Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization in November 2025, the same category as ISIS. This legal framework let the U.S. treat Maduro not as a head of state with immunity, but as a terrorist who could be captured. When Western sanctions cut Venezuela off, Maduro needed alternative revenue. China and Russia provided loans. Drug trafficking provided cash. Together, they kept Maduro in power outside the Western financial system. This is the method. Partner with traffickers. Provide state protection. Take a cut. Use revenue for regime survival when sanctions hit. Point to Chinese and Russian backing when pressured. Mechanism 5. Gold mining through Arco Minero. In 2016, Maduro opened Arco Minero del Orinoco, 112,000 square kilometers of gold-rich territory in southern Venezuela. He granted concessions to Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and UAE companies. The gold was supposed to go to Venezuela's central bank as reserves. It didn't. It was shipped directly to China, Russia, Turkey, and UAE with no official accounting. Estimates: 15 to 25 tons of gold extracted annually. At $60,000 per kilogram, that's $900 million to $1.5 billion per year. Over 8 years, $7 to $12 billion in gold that left Venezuela without being counted as national reserves. This served two purposes: hard currency, when sanctions prevented banking access, and another channel for personal enrichment with no traceability. This is the method. Open extraction zones in remote areas. Grant concessions to foreign allies. Ship resources directly to buyers. No official recording. Use proceeds for regime survival and personal accounts. These 5 mechanisms working together created the Maduro System. PDVSA provided core cash flow through contracts and diversion. Currency controls created arbitrage profits for the inner circle. Chinese and Russian debt for resource deals provided international backing and permanent resource transfer. Narco-terrorism generated revenue when sanctions cut off legitimate finance. Gold mining provided hard currency outside the banking system. Together, these mechanisms turned Venezuela's $300 billion in oil reserves and resource wealth into Maduro's estimated $2 billion personal fortune. While 8 million Venezuelans fled the country, and 94% of those who remained fell below the poverty line. The system worked exactly as designed. But here's what most people miss about the Maduro system: the capture didn't end it. On the 3rd of January 2026, U.S. Special Forces captured Maduro in a pre-dawn raid in Caracas. President Trump announced the operation, saying Maduro would face justice in New York for narco-terrorism. The Venezuelan dictator who ruled for 12 years, who turned the country with the world's largest oil reserves into a failed state, was removed from power in a matter of hours. Most people think this was the end. The dictator captured, the system broken, Venezuela free to rebuild. But the Maduro system didn't die with his capture. It's embedded in legal contracts, debt obligations, and resource extraction infrastructure that survives regime change. China still has legal claims to 600,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil production. The loans remain in force regardless of who governs Venezuela. Russia still owns equity stakes in 5 major oil fields through contracts that specify 30-year terms. The gold mining concessions granted to Chinese and Russian companies remain legally valid. The cocaine trafficking routes through Venezuela still exist. The military and government officials who ran Cartel de los Soles are still in positions of power. The system is structural. Removing Maduro removed one man. It didn't remove the mechanisms he built or the international commitments he made. President Trump said the United States would run Venezuela temporarily and be very strongly involved in the oil sector. But unwinding 12 years of Maduro's resource deals requires either paying China and Russia billions to buy out their claims, or declaring the contracts invalid and facing international legal challenges and potential conflict with both powers. The Maduro system survives because it was designed to survive. The genius wasn't in Maduro personally. The genius was in building a structure where personal enrichment created permanent foreign claims on national resources. When the dictator falls, the foreign powers who backed him keep what they acquired. This is the method. Build a system where your corruption serves great power interests. Give China and Russia permanent resource access in exchange for temporary loans and political support. When you're eventually removed, the great powers protect their interests by defending the contracts you signed. Your personal fortune is safe in offshore accounts. The foreign resource claims survive regime change. The system perpetuates itself. Now let me show you who's using the Maduro system right now. Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko owes Russia over $8 billion. Repayment through below-market industrial sales and Russian infrastructure control. Same playbook. Myanmar. Military junta owes China $10 billion. Repayment through jade mines, timber, oil, and gas pipelines. The 2021 coup didn't affect Chinese access. Contracts survived. Equatorial Guinea. Teodoro Obiang uses oil for Chinese loans, ruled 45 years. Personal fortune, $600 million. 76% population in poverty. Identical pattern. Zimbabwe. Emerson Mnangagwa uses Chinese debt for platinum and lithium concessions. Russia secured diamond rights. Same methods. The system spreads because it works. Dictators get rich and stay in power. China and Russia get resources. Only populations lose, and you cannot escape it, because the system isn't about individual leaders. It's about the structure of debt for resources in a world where rival great powers compete for access to oil, minerals, and commodities. China needs resources to fuel its economy. Russia needs resources to generate revenue and maintain geopolitical influence. Authoritarian leaders have resources but need money and protection from Western pressure. The exchange is simple. Leaders get loans, political backing, and personal enrichment. China and Russia get permanent resource access through contracts that survive regime change. The populations get poverty and authoritarianism. The system works for everyone except the people whose resources are being sold. This is Maduro's real legacy, not that he looted Venezuela. Plenty of dictators loot. Maduro's legacy is showing authoritarian leaders how to structure the looting so it serves great power interests and becomes geopolitically protected. He showed them how to turn corruption into strategy. How to sell your nation's future in exchange for personal fortune and regime survival. How to make your theft valuable to powerful foreign interests who will protect the mechanisms even after you're gone. The Maduro system is the architecture of resource extraction in the multipolar order, and it's spreading because it works. It works for the dictators who get rich. It works for China and Russia who get resources. It only doesn't work for the populations whose wealth is being transferred and whose sovereignty is being sold. You might think you're not affected. You don't live in Venezuela or Belarus or Myanmar. But the system affects you. When China secures permanent access to Venezuelan oil through debt, it affects global oil prices and supply. When authoritarian regimes use narco-terrorism to survive sanctions, cocaine floods Western markets and kills Americans. When resource sovereignty is sold to rival powers, it shifts the balance of global power away from Western-led institutions and toward a multipolar order where authoritarian capitalism competes with democratic capitalism. The Maduro system isn't just about Venezuela. It's about how the international order is being reshaped through debt, resource extraction, and great power competition. And you live in that system, whether you recognize it or not. So what do? How do you respond to a system that's restructuring global resource control? 3 options. 1. Accept it. Understand that the multipolar order means authoritarian leaders will trade resource sovereignty to China and Russia. Accept that Western sanctions and pressure won't work when rival powers provide alternative backing. Accept that resources will flow from democratic nations to authoritarian regimes to rival great powers. Make your decisions accordingly. 2. Resist it. Support policies that counter Chinese and Russian resource acquisition. Back military interventions like the one that captured Maduro when dictators cross lines on narco-terrorism and threaten Western interests. Support opposition movements in authoritarian states. Accept that resistance is expensive, risky, and often fails, but fight anyway. 3. Understand it and position accordingly. If the system is transferring resources from unstable authoritarian states to China and Russia, and if China and Russia are using those resources to build economic and military power, then the geopolitical competition will intensify. Position for a world where resource access determines power, where authoritarian capitalism competes with democratic capitalism, where the rules-based international order fragments into spheres of influence. This isn't investment advice. This is pattern recognition. The Maduro system has shown authoritarian leaders how to survive in a multipolar world. It will continue spreading because the incentives align for dictators, for China, for Russia. Fighting it is noble but difficult. Ignoring it is dangerous. Understanding it is necessary. Nicolás Maduro was captured on the 3rd of January 2026. He's facing prosecution in New York for narco-terrorism. His 12-year rule destroyed Venezuela and enriched himself and his allies. But the system he built, the debt for resource mechanisms, the Chinese and Russian contracts, the template for authoritarian resource extraction in a multipolar world, that system survived his capture. The system is oil for debt traps, currency arbitrage, state resource diversion, narco-terrorism for regime survival, and foreign resource concessions that survive regime change. It started in Venezuela. It's spreading to Belarus, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, Equatorial Guinea, and every resource-rich authoritarian state that partners with China and Russia. The Maduro system isn't Nicolás Maduro. The system is the method. And the method is being replicated right now because it works. If this video showed you a system you hadn't seen before, if you understand now that authoritarian resource extraction is restructuring the global order, if you see that the capture of one dictator doesn't end the mechanisms he built, then you understand the Maduro system. The system is designed to transfer resource sovereignty from nations to authoritarian leaders backed by great powers. It's designed to survive regime change. It's designed to spread. And you live in a world being reshaped by this system every single day. Welcome to the multipolar order. Welcome to the Maduro system.